You can access them by clicking on the icon that looks like 3 pieces of paper. Also, as our host Justin noted a minute ago, today's webinar is being recorded. It'll be available in about 2 weeks on our website, so if you'd like to revisit or you just want to hear the sound of our voices again, you will be able to do so. We will give you that website address when we talk about resources. So you know what to expect. Here's the information that we'll be providing over the next hour. We'll be giving a general overview of community eligibility, which we will also lovingly refer to as CEP. We'll talk through some basics about eligibility and how community eligibility works. We'll describe some strategies for success and provide an update on how national implementation has gone this year. On that front in particular, we're very excited to share some positive news. We'll direct you to some tools and resources that will help you consider whether CEP is right for your school system and community. And finally, we will have some time at the end for questions. We'll be only taking typed-in questions via the webinar function, so we have a Q&A log, so you won't need to hold your questions till the end. You can type them in at any point in time throughout the webinar, and we'll answer as many as we can verbally during the Q&A period. Also note that you can ask questions throughout the webinar by clicking on the Q&A tab at the top of the screen and typing your question in. Well, we have a lot of information to cover, so we'll get started now. First, we will talk about some basic information about community eligibility. Community eligibility is a new meal service option that was authorized by the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010. It allows high-need schools to offer free meals, both breakfast and lunches, to all enrolled students for a period of up to 4 years. School districts or local education agencies, LEAs, we'll use those terms interchangeably from this point forward. LEAs make the decision to participate, and they can elect CEP for their entire district, a single school, or a group, or even groups of schools within the same district. There's a lot of flexibility to implement CEP only in the schools where it makes the most sense, and we'll get into that a bit more later in today's presentation. Community eligibility is a powerful tool that can help combat childhood hunger because it simplifies access to school meals, largely by removing the paperwork that families would normally have to complete in order for their children to receive free and reduced price meal benefits. Over the years, we've often heard complaints that the school meal application process can be time-consuming, complicated, confusing, but CEP cuts that out entirely. In bigger picture terms, we also know that almost 16 million children live in food-insecure households, and CEP is one way that we can help ensure that those children who are most needy are well-nourished and ready to learn at school. So otherwise, how is CEP different? Well, schools typically have to determine each student's eligibility for free or reduced price meals, and traditionally that was done through a household application, which I've mentioned on the previous slide, and those applications were based on household income. The other method that we've used is a process known as direct certification, and that means that a student is certified as eligible for free meals based on their participation in other, often means-tested federal assistance programs, such as the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF. In high-need schools where a large proportion of students are directly certified and eligible for free meals, CEP capitalizes on the data matching between those other assistance programs. So in CEP schools, a high percentage of students are typically certified without the household application regardless. We'll talk through the specifics in a few minutes, but in addition to eliminating household applications, we did want to highlight some of the other numerous benefits of CEP. In CEP schools, all students have access to free healthy meals at school. I've already covered that. When everyone getting free meals is the norm, there's no stigma attached to getting a free meal. And so participation in the school meal programs tends to increase. In a recent evaluation that we conducted of the pilot states that helped us roll out CEP over the last few school years, participation in the school breakfast program increased on average by 9% in CEP schools, and lunch participation increased by 5%. There are also benefits for parents. They don't have to complete a household application or worry about keeping enough money in meal accounts. And they also have the certitude of knowing that their child has an opportunity to eat at school. And finally, for schools themselves, we've already mentioned the administrative efficiencies, but meal service operations can be streamlined in general. Lines move faster, and kids have more time to eat because you've got simplified point of service. There's a whole lot less money changing hands. That means that less food is thrown away when kids have more time, and they leave the cafeteria better nourished. Because all the meals are served free, that also opens the door to inclusive and innovative approaches to meal service, like breakfast in the classroom, which can further boost your participation numbers. And above all, and I think this is key, teachers have to worry a whole lot less about whether or not the kids who come to class have had the opportunity for a good meal, and that in itself is a big deal. Just before we move on, even for state agencies that administer our programs, there's a streamlined review process during the administrative review when it comes to CEPs because there are no applications to pour over. And so you can see just CEP is a win-win situation on many different levels. So now we'll get into the details. Eligibility for CEP is based on the percentage of identified students who are enrolled. That's a new term. Identified students are children who are directly certified or categorically eligible for free meals because they participate in another assistance program. So basically, that's any time a child is certified without a household application. These identified students must make up at least 40% of the total enrollment in order for a school, a group of schools, or a school district to participate in CEP. And we call that the Identified Student Percentage, or ISP. Other items for eligibility, schools have to participate in both the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program, and also the programs must be operated in accordance with regulations, and beyond that, participating LEAs must have a history of good compliance. A little bit more info about the ISP before we move on. I promise this is not overly scary math. We calculate the ISP by dividing the number of identified students by the number of enrolled students, and then we multiply that figure by 100 just to make it more friendly to look at. And that's really all it is. Again, whichever entity is electing CEP, whether that's a school, a group of schools, the entire district, multiple groups within the same district, each school or grouping in aggregate needs to meet the 40% threshold. That's really what's key, and we'll revisit that concept shortly. So who specifically are these identified students? Once again, the identified students are children who are directly certified or categorically eligible for free meals without a household application. But what does that mean? There are a limited set of categories that those students fall into. Those are listed right here on the slide. Those include SNAP and TANF participants, participants in the food distribution program on Indian reservations, or they can be students who have federal status as migrant, homeless, runaway, foster children, or children who participate in the Head Start program. For the enrolled students, the denominator of the identified student percentage, that includes any student who is enrolled in the participating school or schools and has access to at least one meal at school on a typical day, either breakfast or lunch. Pretty straightforward. The ISP itself is not just the basis, though, for eligibility to participate in CEP. It's also the basis for how meals are claimed, and more importantly, at which reimbursement rate. Cash reimbursements for the school meal programs under CEP are calculated using the identified student percentage times a factor of 1.6. The reason for this multiplier is so we can approximate the free and reduced price percentage that would be obtained if applications were still being collected. That also makes the multiplied ISP a very useful proxy for the free and reduced percentage, reduced price percentage in other contexts, which we'll revisit later. But bottom line, the multiplied ISP gives the meals reimbursed at the federal free rate. If that total happens to be less than 100%, then the remaining meals are instead reimbursed at the paid rate, which is much lower. So if you do the quick math, then the identified student percentage, if it's at least 62.5, then that means that all of the meals are reimbursed at the free rate. And that's the most reimbursement that you can possibly receive from us. On the other side of the coin, however, if the federal reimbursement is less than the cost of providing all students free meals, then the difference must be paid from non-federal sources. Don't let that scare you. This isn't unique to community eligibility. It's the same for Provision 2 and 3 schools. Those are the other universal meal service options that we have already been offering for a few decades now. And it's also the same for standard operations when the federal reimbursement is less than the cost of providing meals. All the programs need to achieve the break-even point. It's just a matter of determining at the local level what's going to work out best for you. Of course, that doesn't mean that participating schools need to. That does mean that participating schools need to consider the financial impact of CEP, and we'll talk a little bit later about a tool that we've developed that can help you with those considerations when you're planning. Before I turn things over to Heather, I do want to talk a little bit more about grouping, since we get questions in this area often. We've mentioned that a district can elect CEP for a single school, or a group, or groups of schools, or for the entire district. And so when you're grouping together two or more schools, the ISP is determined by adding all of the identified students for each school in the group, and dividing that figure by the sum of the enrolled students for each school. And so they're aggregate figures. You add all of your students up across all schools, and then you divide. Other than adding your identified student and enrollment figures beforehand, calculating the group ISP is really pretty much the same as it would be for calculating an individual school. It's just that you're adding up all the figures, so it's reflective of the totals for all of the schools put together. One feature of CEP that I'll highlight here related to the grouping is that some schools in a group may not meet the 40% threshold on their own. But because the group ISP is at least 40%, they can still get on board. The key here is that the group ISP is still 40% in these situations. This is a requirement that when the schools are grouped, we don't apply to, the 40% requirement doesn't apply to individual schools. It applies to the entire group across the board. And that is often what allows districts to neatly implement CEP across all of their schools district-wide and reap the administrative savings that you get from having a single streamlined meal service system. Because otherwise, you know, you'd in your average high-poverty district, you'd have to implement in all but a few schools and still have to maintain two or more accounting and claiming systems. So really the grouping mechanic is very powerful in helping to simplify and pave the road for district-wide CEP elections. We have an example here on the next slide to illustrate this point. And so here we have just a very simple example of three schools grouped together within a school district. School 2, as you can see, does not meet the 40% identified student percentage threshold on its own. And so it wouldn't be eligible to participate in CEP if it wanted to elect on its own because they're just below the threshold at 38%. However, when that school is grouped with schools 1 and 3, you can see that the entire group has an ISP of 59%, and so they can all participate in CEP together. And so with that, I will hand things over to my colleague, Heather.
Thanks, Kevin. Before we move on, we've received several questions typed in about where folks can access the slides. And just want to repeat what Kevin said at the beginning of the webinar. In the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see an icon that looks like 3 little pieces of paper, and the slides are available for download by clicking on that icon. So now we want to move on to talk about CEP enrollment and how you know if you're eligible to participate. So We'll spend the next few minutes talking through some of the important dates and some things to think through as you consider adopting CEP. So if you're thinking about electing CEP for next school year, the identified student percentage is determined on April 1st of this year, or the year that's preceding your CEP election. On April 15th, state agencies have to notify school districts of their district-wide eligibility status, and school districts also have to provide school-level eligibility data to state agencies on April 15th. Both eligibility lists have to be published on state websites on May 1st. And then we at USDA also put links to all of the eligibility data nationwide on our website. Finally, June 30th is the election deadline, or the date that districts electing CEP need to notify their state agency of their intent to participate. So those are just some dates to keep in mind as you move through the decision-making process. So if you're eligible and interested in exploring CEP more, one of the most important things you can do is figure out the numbers. And by that, we mean determine how you'd like to participate and also make sure it's financially viable. The ability to elect CEP at different levels, like Kevin mentioned, offers a lot of flexibility. If you're thinking about trying out CEP, perhaps electing for a single school makes most sense. As we've mentioned, grouping can bring in schools with lower ISPs, and it can also help avoid parent confusion. For example, perhaps grouping schools that feed into each other makes the most sense, so parents aren't confused by having to pay for a child at one school and having another child getting free meals at a different school. And electing district-wide, if that's feasible for you, offers the most operational efficiencies. We want your CEP election to be successful, so making a sound financial decision is important. CEP was phased in over 3 years in 10 states and the District of Columbia. An evaluation study of the participating districts found that the average identified student percentage was around 55% or higher. We encourage you to take a look at that evaluation study, which is available on our website, which we'll give to you in the resources section a little bit later. We also encourage you to take a look at the estimator tool that's available on our website. And the tool lets you compare your federal reimbursement under standard operating procedures to an estimate of what your federal reimbursement would be under CEP. That estimator also contains a grouping tool that lets you compare different groups and their identified student percentages. Another thing you can do in advance of the April 1st identified student date is to maximize your ISP. And you can do this by ensuring that you're capturing the identified students from all possible sources. This will allow you to get the highest ISP and, in turn, the highest federal reimbursement. And once you've determined you want to elect CEP, let your state agency know by June 30th. Each state has its own application process, but you'll need to submit documentation to support your ISP, and that usually includes your lists of your identified students. Once you submit that information, your state agency will review it and make sure you meet their eligibility requirements, and then, of course, provide any necessary training and technical assistance to help with implementation. If you find CEP is not working, you can elect to stop at any time and resume standard counting and claiming. You'll have to notify your state agency, and you'll have 30 days to take applications and resume standard operating procedures. That also means adhering to all the certification and verification requirements. If you need to make changes during your 4-year cycle, the ISP that's determined at the start of the CEP election is guaranteed for 4 years. However, participating schools can check their ISP each April 1st and elect to keep the ISP from the year prior to the initial CEP election, or if it's higher, establish a new ISP. In the 4th year of CEP participation, schools that have an ISP that's dropped to less than 40%, but is still more than 30%, are able to elect CEP for a 5th year. We call that the grace year. So before we wrap up and take questions, we want to touch on one of the primary barriers that we hear about, and that's how to allocate educational funding without the school meals application data. For a long time, school meal applications have served as a socioeconomic indicator and used to allocate federal, state, and local education funding. We'll have some upcoming webinars that address these topics in greater detail, but we want to spend a few minutes touching on them now so that you know that not collecting applications as it relates to this funding is not a barrier to CEP participation. For child nutrition programs, the free claiming percentage, or the ISP times the 1.6 multiplier, serves as a proxy for the percentage of free and reduced price students. And that means it can be used to determine area eligibility for federal child nutrition programs like the Summer Food Service Program or the Seamless Summer option. There's also Title I. We've worked very closely with our colleagues at the Department of Education to develop guidance on how school districts can comply with Title I requirements while operating CEP. This guidance is available on our website and walks through several options that CEP school districts have to meet requirements. If you're concerned about Title I allocations, we encourage you to review that guidance and determine which option will work best in your district. We've also worked closely with the Federal Communications Commission to determine how E-rate discounts are determined for CEP schools. This year, participating schools can use the school lunch eligibility data that was previously submitted for the most recent funding year in which they did not participate in CEP. Starting next school year, for school year 15-16, schools will use their claiming percentage, or the ISP times 1.6, as a proxy for the free and reduced price percentage. And that means that participating schools will enter the ISP times 1.6 into the E-rate discount calculation template for each school in the group. And that's capped at 100%. We also know that state and local funding streams depend on school meal application data to allocate money, and communication is key here. For state funding, we encourage you to discuss your options with your state agency. Most states have resolved or are working to eliminate any barriers to CEP participation. The same is true for local funding. We encourage you to start a dialogue with all the stakeholders to determine what the options are for allocating funds without application data. There are several other socioeconomic indicators that can be used to allocate funds, so it's a matter of looking at the other options and deciding which works best for the funding stream or the group that's providing the benefit. So we encourage you to include all your stakeholders as early as possible in your conversations about CEP, and that could be any or all of the parties listed on this slide. So before we finish, we want to spend a few minutes talking about the national implementation this year and tell you where to find some of the resources that we've talked about. We're really excited to share with you our fantastic success in implementing CEP nationwide. We don't have official program data yet. However, we have conducted a series of voluntary but comprehensive data collections, which have helped us to construct a very positive picture of what schools have done in this first year. As of December, CEP was operating in almost 14,000 schools in over 2,000 school districts. And to give you a sense of the reach that CEP has achieved in such a short amount of time, I can also tell you that CEP schools can be found in 49 states in the District of Columbia, and that we have secured access to free school meals every day for 6.4 million children. We also know that CEP works in school districts of any size. For example, 2/3 of the 75 school districts that we identified as the largest by enrollment and most eligible for CEP are implementing this year, either district-wide or for a portion of their schools. However, over 90% of the districts participating in CEP have an enrollment of fewer than 5,000 students. Nearly half have an enrollment of less than 500. So we know that CEP has been embraced by schools with a wide variety of characteristics. I think the numbers alone speak to how we've come so far so quickly, and also that fast progress is already benefiting vulnerable children in all parts of our country. And in fact, implementation is ongoing. This year, in an effort to provide maximum flexibility to state and local officials, we are actually allowing continuous CEP enrollment throughout the year. Normally there's a hard deadline of June 30th in order to do CEP for the following school year, but this year there's no deadline. And just a couple of weeks ago, we got news that a large urban district would be implementing CEP in some of their schools. And so we've continued to get more school districts on board throughout the year. And that sustained interest has been very encouraging as we look ahead to the future. If you're thinking about participating in CEP and your state agency okays it, trying it out for the last few months of this school year may be a great trial run. We have similarly received tremendous positive feedback from state and local officials in jurisdictions where CEP has been implemented. We've heard many stories from across the country about increases in participation in both the breakfast and lunch programs in schools that have adopted CEP, as well as the benefits that come with that. And significantly, we've regularly heard from officials that they were successful in overcoming funding barriers, such as those related to Title I allocations. Both in terms of the data and the anecdotal evidence, this has been a great win all around. We fully expect that CEP elections will continue to increase next year and in subsequent years based on the high interest of some districts that have been on the fence up until this point, and also because of the pattern that we've observed in all the pilot states. They all saw bigger numbers in year 2, and that trend is likely to continue as we implement nationwide. This slide lists our website where you'll find many of the tools we talked about, including the recording of this webinar will also be housed here. There's policy guidance, information about requirements, the estimator and grouping tool that we spoke about, and CEP guidance from other federal agencies such as the Department of Education and the FCC. We really appreciate your feedback, and we need you to share your successes and challenges with us. So please continue to let us know what works and what doesn't as you seek to implement CEP. We are listening, and we definitely want your implementation to be successful. And now, if you'll give us a minute to take a look at some of the questions that you've submitted, we'll respond verbally to those. Several of you commented on the size of the slides. We'll make the slides available on our website. Our apologies if you had difficulty viewing those. Another question is about the Seamless Summer Program and says, can you please explain how CEP data is to be used in the Seamless Summer Program? Specifically, will any site that has an ISP greater than 50% be reimbursed at 100% free, or only at the rate they claimed under the National School Lunch Program? Any site that has an ISP of at least 32.5 would meet the 50% free and reduced price percentage needed to offer all meals free.
Keep in mind that the ISP figure that's used for the purpose of summer area eligibility is the multiplied ISP, and so it's going to be your ISP figure times 1.6. Any school or schools that are outright eligible would not have to worry about the 50% threshold because their multiplied ISP would already be well north of that.
And just to clarify also, area eligibility is based on an individual school's ISP, even if they are part of a group. Another question is about participating for 4 consecutive years, and if that resets if you go off CEP for 1 year. Yes, if you go off CEP for 1 year and resume standard counting and claiming, you would need to reset your identified student percentage to come back on CEP. Another question is about a state requirement to submit performance information such as test scores for free and reduced price students. And at CEP schools, those students wouldn't be identified, and how would those numbers and test scores be reported? Previous year, ISP times 1.6 or entire school as an aggregate. This is an area where early communication can help. We encourage you to talk with the group that requires that information to determine if they need individual student data or if they can accept aggregate information, and determine what your options are and what would work best for the group that requires the information.
So we've got a question about when the ISP needs to be recalculated when in the middle of a 4-year cycle based on changes in enrollment. This is a good question, and we receive it often. Generally, as a rule of thumb, what you're interested in as far as your ISP calculation is concerned is your population of students in a group. And so something that's purely an administrative change, like, say, a school closing or opening or splitting into 2 or more schools or merging, it wouldn't cause you necessarily to have to recalculate your ISP if that population of students was staying the same. For example, if you had 3 schools grouped together and you merged 2 of them into one, you could still keep that group of students together. It would be technically 2 schools, but it's the same students. And so what triggers an ISP recalculation is a change in population. For example, if your school district redrew its boundaries and the student population for one or more of your groups or schools was different. But something where you're just changing the way that you've arranged those students for the purposes of school administration wouldn't necessarily have an impact. It's the population of students that you are serving.
Someone mentioned that the web page for E-rate guidance is currently unavailable and asked if there's another source for that documentation. We'll check that link and make sure it's working after this webinar.
Also, the E-rate guidance itself, I'm not sure if this was the what's being referred to as the actual web page on the FCC website. If that's the case, FNS has also organized a policy memo that highlights the changes from FCC's policy guidance, because they actually reorganized the program. They did a huge overhaul recently, and the CEP section is actually like a 1 or 2 pages or a couple of paragraphs of a huge document. And so we actually have a policy memo that just covers the FCC guidance.
Next question, do families that participate in CEP still have to fill out a meal application to calculate Title I funding? Some states have determined that in order to allocate funding, that districts need to collect what we're calling an alternate income form. It is not a school meals application and cannot be paid for out of the nonprofit school food service account, but in some states it looks very similar to a school meals application. If there are ways around that, we encourage you to look for other options, because it does negate some of the paperwork burden that CEP alleviates, but we do understand that there are some funding streams that are requiring that information. So some states have made the decision that an alternate income form is required for their states. Next question, can first-year charter schools participate? Yep, as long as they meet the eligibility requirements, new schools, either public or charter schools, can participate. Understandably, those schools would not have data from April 1st of the prior year because they didn't exist. But as long as they can establish their identified student percentage before they start counting and claiming, they can participate in CEP.
And so we actually have one question asking if we've run into any consistent opposition as far as CEP implementation is concerned. And I'd say overall we've actually gotten a tremendous response at all levels, state and local. In general, I think there's a broad recognition that CEP, bottom line, benefits children. It simplifies the provision of meals in very high needs areas. And so oftentimes the concerns that have been expressed have not been so much like, well, we just don't like the idea of CEP. They've been very practical concerns related to how are we going to reallocate funding and adjust other policies that have relied on the way that that free and reduced price meal eligibility has been established in years past. There's a whole universe of targeted assistance that has relied on these school meal applications. And so largely when we encounter barriers, they've been related to those sorts of issues and how can we get around it. And so that's why we've been highlighting the importance of bringing stakeholders into the conversation early, getting people on board, making sure that they are aware of the changes that might be coming if you're considering CEP implementation, because that will help to ensure a smoother path. But in general, I would say that we've actually enjoyed very broad support, and CEP in this first year especially has been a great success story.
Next question, where can you get more information about Title I and E-rate under CEP? We do have some resources available on our website, which is slide number 34, if you've downloaded the slide deck. Guidance from both the Department of Education and the Federal Communications Commission are both available there. Next question, can charter schools participate in CEP? And after the 4-year cycle, how does a school reapply? Yes, charter schools can participate. And at the end of the 4-year cycle, you would look at your ISP, that last year, the April 1st of that last year, and determine that you're still eligible and talk with your state agency about starting a new 4-year cycle. Next question is what about the College Board, the free SAT for free and reduced price students, and how will CEP affect this? We know this is an issue. It's been raised to our attention by a couple of state agencies, and we've reached out to the College Board. We'll be having a conversation with them that's scheduled within the next week to talk about some other ways that they can provide this funding in the absence of school meals applications. So we hope to have that resolved soon.
And I've got a question. Does this include free and reduced meal status or only free? When we've often referred to the multiplied ISP as a proxy for free and reduced price percentage, but there is no reduced price category with CEP. I think the key thing to note here is that all of the meals are served free to the students no matter what. They don't, the money doesn't exchange hands from student to school or household to school. And so to the students themselves, the meals are all served free of charge. On the back end, CEP also simplifies the reimbursements. There's only 2 categories, free and paid. And so if you recall from the presentation, any percentage of meals that are not reimbursed at the federal free rate are reimbursed paid rate. And so CEP eliminates the reduced price category. It doesn't exist even from a reimbursement standpoint.
Next question is if the USDA estimator tool is the best way to determine if CEP would be beneficial for your school district. It's one tool that's available for your use. Like we mentioned, it lets you compare your reimbursement under standard operating procedures under an estimate of your reimbursement under CEP. I would encourage you to talk with your state agency. There are some state agencies who've also developed pretty nifty tools that have grouping calculators, and they may have a tool that's also available for your use. But like any tool, it's as good as the information that you put into it. So it's just one tool that's available to help you determine if CEP is financially viable. Next question is if a district uses family applications and does not opt for CEP at all schools, then are the applications just provided at the schools that are non-CEP? And yes, that's the case. You would just take applications at your non-CEP schools.
So we have a question from a district that's asking that if you are only participating in your elementary schools and eligibility normally carries over to the next year, would the student have the extended eligibility at the beginning of the year, or would an application need to be received before school starts? This is another good question, and the answer is typically no. We did that the 30-day period of free eligibility does not necessarily extend to the student going from a CEP school to a non-CEP school the following year. And the reason for that is because with CEP, you're no longer making individual eligibility determinations. You're making, you're generating an aggregate claiming percentage across the entire school. That said, the reason I said not necessarily is because if you have a direct certification record for that student from the previous year, then you can in fact use the direct certification record to extend that 30-day period for the following year. When it doesn't apply is when you have a student that would not have been directly certified. And so that's not an automatic carryover like it would be in other cases where they were receiving a free meal one year and then going to a different school.
Next question is about planning and possibly expanding and adding a school campus next year and how that would impact CEP, and if that new campus would be included in the program. Like I mentioned, new schools are eligible to elect CEP. They just have to determine their identified student percentage before they start counting and claiming. So you would just need to take a look at the numbers, and if you're implementing this year, how the addition of that school impacts your identified student percentage and your claiming percentage.
Again, if it's just a new campus, but you're serving the same students as the previous year, then no ISP recalculation would be required. However, if it's really a new campus and new students being brought into your system, then yes, they could be grouped with the previous group, but you would have a new ISP and a new base year that includes those new students.
Another question about combining two schools. For the school ISP, would you need to average the two schools? The populations would be combined. I'm not sure if that's a question about grouping or two schools merging together, but in either case, you would sum the identified students at each school and divide by the sum of the enrolled students.
And so you'd basically, if you had two schools, School A and School B, you'd add the enrollment of School A and the enrollment of School B together for your denominator, and you'd add the identified students for School A and the identified students for School B for your numerator, and then you divide that. You're not doing any pre-averaging or anything like that and mixing them together. It's really just a matter of adding up all of the totals for the schools and then doing one simple calculation to get the group ISP.
Just want to share a tip. Lindsay from Illinois, which is one of our early adopting states, shared a tip they're using in Illinois when in cases where individual student socioeconomic data is needed. They have a sample household and income form that schools can use. It's not tied to the school meals program. It's a socioeconomic data form, and some of their schools do use the form to collect individual student data. And again, she stressed that printing and distributing of the forms can't be paid for with the school meals fund. So thanks, Lindsay, for sharing that tip. Next question is, what are state agencies expected to collect from school districts as documentation of the ISP? Again, every state has developed their own application process. States should be able to substantiate the ISP. So, for example, we know that some states are reviewing 100% of the names on the ISP list at the time of application. It's doing that work up front reduces the burden during the administrative review, because if you've done that work up front, then you only have to look at the lists on the administrative review if there's been a change in the ISP. We've suggested that that states should at least follow the administrative review procedures, which would be looking at at least 10 random names from the list, up to 10%, just making sure you can find the names on the appropriate list, so that, when it comes time to do an administrative review, there are no surprises. Okay, next question is about the April 1st date and when numbers have to be submitted to the state agency. Can we go back to the important date slide? Someone's asking us to just re-review the important dates. So these are coming up. So April 1st is the date on which the identified student percentage has to be established for the following school year. April 15th is when the state agencies notify the districts of their district-wide eligibility status, and then districts send their school-level eligibility data to the state agencies. May 1st is when the links to those lists are posted on the state website and collected by USDA, which we in turn post on our website. And then June 30th is when interested school districts need to notify their state agency of their intent to participate. Next question is, where in the CEP guidance does it indicate that child nutrition funds cannot be used for alternate meal application collection? That's we have a policy memo available on our website that talks about the alternate meal applications. Basically, it's not a requirement to participate in this program, and that's why the nonprofit school food service account can't be used to pay for this.
I mean, this is a point that we've clarified in the Q&A document, but it regardless, even without the Q&A guidance, it runs afoul of our standing program regulations. It's not an activity that is, directly benefiting the administration of a school food service program, and so it wouldn't be an allowable cost that you could charge to the school service account regardless.
Next question is about E-rate, and if we stated that for E-rate, the ISP can be utilized. Starting next year in school year 15-16, the ISP times the multiplier 1.6 can be used to approximate the free and reduced price percentages for E-rate discounts. Next question, if at the beginning of the second year it's determined that the percentage of free would increase and the district decides to reapply, what ramifications could the district encounter? There are no negative consequences to this. That's why, we encourage you to still look at your numbers every April 1st, and if you can claim a higher free percentage, we encourage you to do so.
We've got a question about whether or not SNAP households that were approved via case number can be added to the ISP. In nearly all cases, you're going to be extending meal benefits via SNAP through the direct certification process. However, for the purposes of generating the ISP, you can actually also use a letter from the agency that administers the SNAP program in your state. That is the only other acceptable method that you can add students to the ISP based on their SNAP participation. It cannot be a process that involves receiving any kind of material from the household. And so, if you were doing an alternative application asking for case numbers or something like that, you couldn't include those those households, those children in your ISP. But if you were getting documentation directly from the state agency administering SNAP, those could be included. But in nearly all cases, you're going to be relying on direct certification.
Next question. This is our first year implementing CEP. What data would we use for April 1st? Is it the same data we used from 13-14, or do we use this year's 14-15 data prior to April 1st this school year? The identified student percentage is based on the April 1st of the year preceding your CEP election. You do have the option, like we mentioned, of looking at your data every April 1st and seeing if your free claiming percentage would be higher. You can keep your initial ISP it's guaranteed for a period of 4 years, or you have the option of adopting the new ISP if it would be higher for you. Next question, is CEP reimbursement based on the actual number of students who were served meals or based on enrollment for that month? The reimbursement is based on the number of, or the meal counts. So you would take your meal counts and multiply them by your identified student percentage to get the meals that are reimbursed free. So it's based on the number of meal counts.
Yeah. You're basically applying the claiming percentage to your meal count. To get your combination of meals that will be reimbursed free versus at the paid rate.
Next question, what about a 10-day grace period for students going from a CEP school to a non-CEP school during the school year? That's correct. We have a Q&A on our website about this. Within a district, there is a 10-day grace period for a student that moves from a CEP to a non-CEP school, where the student would receive free meals for 10 days until a certification can be made with a household application. Another question is if Lindsay would be willing to share the state alternate income application that they use. We're in the process right now of putting together a web portal where we can share some of the forms that states have developed and some best practices. So we'll look to get that information from Lindsay and share it out. Another question about some changes in a school district, about schools closing and taking a middle school and making it an elementary school, and redistricting a district, and how would you do CEP? Again, you would have to take a look at the changes that are being made. It says you're implementing CEP district-wide this year, so having that information makes it seem like the students in the district would, basically be the same unless the redistricting somehow changes the enrolled students or the identified students. So you would just have to take a look at the changes you're making and how that changes those two categories, either the identified students or the enrolled students. Okay. We didn't get through all the questions, but we are out of time. And what we'll look to do is respond individually to folks with the information that you provided to dial into the call. Before we close, just want to make you all aware of some of our upcoming CEP webinars in the hopes that you can save the date and join us. Thank you very much for participating. Have a great afternoon.